to open the symposium, we'd like to talk about some of the work that we've been doing whilst we've been traveling around the country for the last couple of years, talking to people about what is the point or the purpose of assessment
Assessment.
in higher education. So we'll start start this as we have done with many others. We'd like to ask you guys, what do you think the purpose of assessment is in higher education? And we've sort of tried to create a shorter, condensed version of the work that we've been doing whilst we've been traveling around. I'll let Angie sort of talk us through it.
Yeah, thank you. So if you are on the Menti now, you should have access to a slide that asks you to rate or rank purposes of assessment from most to least important. So this was an exercise we've done with a number of students at Hull and a number of staff at Hull, and we also took it out to use it with our partners. A longer version of that. And there were some statements that are very clearly assessment as learning, some that are clearly assessment for learning, some that maybe are potentially maybe slightly contentious for people. And the idea was essentially, what really is the purpose of assessment for contemporary higher education programs? Are all staff and all students, to coin a phrase, singing from the same hymn sheet? Do they understand its purposes to be the same? Which was a really interesting question for us. So you should be able to access now your Mentimeter. Can everybody access that? And we'd like you to actually try and rank those purposes from what you feel are the most to the least important. And you'll have a couple of minutes to do that.
So this is a selection of some of the purposes that we feel that are the most interesting. We recognise that it's not all of the purposes. There is the one that we've been working with more broadly is more expansive.
Yes.
But we wanted to use this as an opportunity to generate some discussion and not just talk at you guys for a whole day. And see that we're starting to get some responses in. It was quite tricky to think about how to do this because we normally take about 2 hours
Yes.
to have this discussion whilst we've been going out, and it takes it's been taking people about an hour to go through the Q sort methodology. So it was quite challenging to think about a way of doing it where we can have sort of initiate a discussion within sort of 5 minutes or so. So yeah, hopefully this does the trick. But I'm seeing a fair number of people have logged on. Okay, should we give people like 1 more minute or
One
so?
more minute, I think. Yes, 1 more minute.
I will put a timer on. There we go. The 1 minute started.
1 minute to go.
We'll let everybody focus and stop nattering.
Oh, please, my camera's now working again. I don't know what's up with it. Somebody from Tasmania. Matthew Hillier. Brilliant. Right, I think we should have had a reasonable number of responses in now.
We've got 33, 34, 35. There we go. I'll allow new responses so people can carry on. But
That's a good idea. Yes.
I'll release the results so that people can see. So this is I've released the results. Andrew, are you able to see?
I'm just waiting. They've not appeared on my screen yet.
Can everybody? More importantly, can everybody else see the results?
Can everybody see the results?
Yeah. Okay. So I mean, it looks to me like the ones at the bottom This is really interesting. This seems really quite consistent with the broader results that we found um, in our work. So particularly at the bottom, indicating the overall employability of a student and grading students' work so that comparisons can be made between students. Um,
Yeah.
And then at the top, the idea of developing students as independent learners and obtaining ownership and autonomy,
Yeah.
and then the value of providing feedback to learners about their about their attempts. So that there's really high importances of feedback and ownership, um, and then really interestingly. We've got developing students' competence in the kinds of tasks they need to perform within a specific and discipline aligned profession. So this is quite interesting. This is
It
quite
is.
interesting in the context of when we talk to different programs, the balance between the sort of the general skills and the preparation for a specific career or industry it really depends upon that alignment of where the program is. And there's been some really interesting conversations we've had between vocationally aligned subjects or professionally aligned subjects and disciplinary aligned subjects. Um, so yeah. And then in the middle, developing perseverance, confidence, and other positive psychological attributes, and objective evidence of the student's strengths and weaknesses. Um, so I'll just talk a little bit. Were you able to see that screen in the end, Andrew, or not?
I can't get to see the results on my screen anyway. No.
Okay.
Can't seem
Um,
to access them, Dom.
um, so very interestingly, this reflects quite
Got that up
closely
there.
to what we found in our work. So we've used
Yeah.
something we stole a a method from psychology called the Q sort. And
We
what we
did.
did with these groups was we had all of these different statements, and we had 18 different statements about the purposes of assessment that were aligned to either assessment of learning or assessment as learning. Aligned to who derives the value from the work, so whether it's the student, society, or the institution, and then about when that value is derived. So is it derived now, or in a personal future, or in a professional future?
Mm, mm.
And then we sat people down and we let them have conversations in groups to discuss to have at it. And some quite interesting conversations, wasn't it,
There were
Andrew?
some really interesting discussions coming out, yeah, and some people very and there was also, I think, one thing that struck me very strongly was people were when they were trying to rank and rate them was, well, do I rank them, rate them in terms of what would happen in an ideal world, what I would like to happen, or do I rank and rate them as things actually do happen? And there was quite a big difference there between say, well, I know we should be doing this, I know we could do, we want to do this, but in reality, we have to do this. And that, I think that could lead to some quite different, interesting results where people say, well, yeah, I'd love to put that there, but really, it has to go here.
Um, so in terms of what we actually found, as I say, really similar to what you guys have done as a group, which I think sort of really starts to speak to some validity of the results.
Yeah.
So what we have in this screen, what we have on this graph is we have things that are on the top are things that people consistently agreed were important, and then things on the bottom are things that people consistently agreed were unimportant.
Yeah.
So at the top again, we've got developing independent learners, providing feedback, and then the future-based value of what is being learned. So how it prepares students for future professions, whether that's a specific one or those transferable skills. But then at the bottom, we have a consistent, again, a sort of consistent agreement that
Mm.
grading students' work and overall employability are not important.
Mm. And
But
this
we
this was
think,
a real eye opener for me because one would expect that for many people out there as employers, the assessment should be able to provide that, is the student employable, or how employable is the student?
I mean, and this is, I think this is quite problematic because I would say, as lecturers, we spend most of our effort with our assessment spending time grading and creating classifications. And I think, we sell the final gradings, or society sells degrees as indicators of, of student employability and competence.
Mm.
So I suppose that, the question is should we stop selling it as that because it isn't, or should we change what we do so that it is? And again, all of that effort that we spend marking and grading and on allocating a number to a student, is that what the purpose of assessment is? And if it isn't, then maybe we should spend a bit less time doing it.
A lot less time doing it,
or a lot less time doing it, a lot less effort into it.
Yeah. Another interesting one as well is the one around developing enthusiasm for the subject, discipline, or profession. Quite a few people we spoke to said, well, students should come to us with that. It's something that we want to do, but it isn't a function of assessment. And then we got to sort of thinking, well, maybe it isn't a function of assessment, but if the assessment doesn't actually enthuse a student in some way, they're not really going to enjoy doing it. And it should help them better to understand and become passionate about the subject.
And then there are also some really interesting ones here about things that people neither agree nor disagree on. So, and this is where the really interesting conversations were, because these are the things where some people really wanted to put them as really important, and some people wanted to put them as really unimportant. These weren't ones where people weren't sure whether they just put them in the middle somewhere. They were often really contentious things. Particularly around the idea of developing students to become an engaged and informed citizen, and we'll discuss this one again when we discuss the ethics, ethics as a competency in a bit. The idea of providing reliable and objective measurement of the quality of a student's work. Well, often the word there that people were objecting to was objective, because the literature and as a body of people, we generally agree that marking is actually quite subjective, but we spend quite a lot of time maintaining the facade that it is, that it is objective.
Yes.
And then, developing student perseverance, confidence, and attributes. Well, we know, and Andrew and I spent a lot of time discussing with students in the library about the impact of assessment. Often it is assessment that is having the biggest impact on the student's perception of themselves as someone who is competent, or of someone who is competent or isn't clever, or it's that grading system, that assessment has the biggest impact on that. So if we do want to develop student confidence, then actually assessment is where we're is where we're going to do that. And then
we've got a couple of responses in the chat. I don't know if you want to pick them up now or wait until the end.
We can. Why don't we make sure we get to the end, and then we've got a big discussion session before lunch. So what we might, if we don't manage to pick them up in the discussion session for this, we can pick them up in the discussion session for lunch.
Not a problem.
But I think the key thing here, and I think Andrew will agree, that the key point is that I think as a sector, we're not in agreement or in a complete agreement about exactly what it is that we're trying to achieve. And not only are we not in agreement as a group of educators, but I think we're probably not in complete agreement with our students about what it is that we're trying to achieve.
Definitely.
Broader society, and industry. So we have lots of different stakeholders involved in universities, involved in higher education, and it's not clear from looking at this data as well as other data is that we're all pulling in the same way. I'll pick up that point. This is So this
is
data
all the lecturers' perspectives,
this data is all the lecturers' data. We've started collecting student data, and we're going to start comparing it against. And I think importantly, just to respond to Caroline, it's not about having the same methods.
No.
It's not about having the same methods, but I think it's about agreeing as a group or as a society exactly what it is that we're trying to do.
Yes, what it is we are trying to do, and to collectively aim for that. And that does allow different universities and different programs to have different aims and different objectives.
Yeah. And I think it's more about finding that agreement. So I think some of the things that were really interesting at that point that Andrew raised about, well, actually, are some people disagreeing about this because we don't think it's something that assessment can do? Or is it, whose responsibility is it? That point that you made, Andrew, about about enthusiasm. What was the reason? Do you remember why people were primarily like?
They said, well, students should come to us being enthused already, and it isn't our role or assessment's role to develop enthusiasm. Yet, if we have students who aren't enthused about the subject, they're not going to achieve well. They're going to be fed up. They're going to drop out. They're going to say this is boring. We need students to be enthused in some way.
And I think that there are some really interesting conversations to be had there about education as performatism and whose job it is to engage the students. And then
this first one about feasibility was really interesting as well, about some of the things that we value in higher education, such as developing independent learners, developing autonomous learners, developing active citizens, ethical values. Attitudes, graduate attitudes are things that are actually quite fuzzy and sometimes very difficult to clarify and to assess. And yet many people feel that these are the things that are really, really important in higher education.
Absolutely. That idea of encouraging students to take ownership of their learning and develop that independence. But yeah, it's very difficult to point at the bit of the curriculum and say, oh yeah, well that's where we know
that in module 3 in the second year or something. Yes,
it's quite challenging.
It is.
And then I think one of the biggest things that came up was that difference between programs that are focused on a very specific endpoint. So where there is a career where students are going into. And then also those sort of disciplinary subjects where the identity isn't something that happens in the future, but it's a subject. And I think those two programs have quite different approaches, and I think they have a lot to learn from each other. I think both of them have things that they do well and things that they that they might. And I think particularly this idea between what's the difference between a degree and a training course. If everything about higher education is to say, oh, well, they're going to go and do this job, and therefore they need to be prepared to do that job. It's removed some of the higher aspect of the education. And then if for example, in my subject in biology, there isn't a career that we can point at and say, oh, well, the student's going to go and do this, they're going to go and be a biologist, or even they're going to go and be a scientist. And one of the partners had a really interesting way of looking at this. It's not about developing people who are going to go and do science, but it's about developing people who can apply a scientific mindset to their personal and professional life. And I thought that was really interesting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we did have some really good discussions about that as well, the difference between a degree and a training course. Okay, so one of the things we have come to realise is, you'll all be familiar with Big's idea of constructive alignment. And we've identified this term constructive disalignment, which it's where the program's tools, the teaching, the assessment, don't actually facilitate the enhancement and realisation of students' aspirational futures. So things within the program may be aligned, but they are aligned to the wrong things.
Yeah. So Do you want to talk through the difference between the misalignment and disalignment, Andrew?
Yeah. So what we're calling constructive disalignment, as you can see, we have top-down program outcomes at the top, then we have an assessment strategy, we have a grading, which we already mentioned, we have learning experience, and people design the curriculum and students experience it. And we could broadly say the curriculum is aligned, but that big question mark at the top is what's it aligned to? And then constructive misalignment is where, as you can see, it's a little bit messier. The program outcomes might be aligned to the students' aspirational futures, but the grading process, the assessment strategy, the learning experiences, the curricular alignment may be aligned to slightly different things. And the idea I think we had really was that on paper, something may look to be constructively aligned. Things are, it'd be very rare, I think, to find a program in higher education now that wouldn't claim it's constructively aligned. But the big question is, what is it constructively aligned to? Is it constructively aligned to something that is no longer fit for purpose for contemporary learners and the aspirational futures of our students?
Yeah, and I think particularly look at there seems to have been an explosion around clearing in the news articles about, well, should all these students be going to university? Is that the best thing for them? And I think for us, some of that speaks to this idea of constructive alignment, of a constructive disalignment, and that lack of surety or that lack of consistency within the data about, well, what it is that we're trying to achieve. And do we really understand what students want to get out of university, and what is the best thing to do in order to prepare them for those aspirational futures? We have in the blog article we produced, we have a specific example around critical thinking, and the idea that there are lots of different ways of conceptualizing critical thinking, but often the way we think about critical thinking is not the same as what an employer might think about critical thinking. So often lecturers conceptualize critical thinking in quite an academic way, about deconstructing papers, about thinking about research methods and whether they're the most appropriate way of going about something. Whereas actually if you look at critical thinking from an employer's perspective, it's often around business orientated problems, or how do we solve specific issues, and it's more that problem solving. And then when we think about it from a societal perspective, it's often about making informed and ethical decisions, and dealing with misinformation. And a lot of the research suggests that the way that we conceptualize, or the way that academic critical thinking doesn't actually transfer very well to societal or informed decisions or problem solving, without training in transferring those things across, explicit parts of the curriculum that help people transfer those things across. So should we introduce the framework?
So we essentially developed this CBAS. Essentially, it's a program development framework which flips the traditional curriculum design. So a traditional curriculum design will be a group of academics get together and they look at there may be some PSRB requirements, or there may be some requirement to meet a few standards, but they'll essentially design the content first. Then they'll look at, well, what are the learning outcomes we need to address? Then they'll put some learning outcomes, they'll arrange the teaching. And kind of right at the end, they think about, well, how are we actually going to assess this? And I'm sure many of you will have been in a situation where you've had a program that somebody else has designed and designed and given to you. When you look at the assessment and think, oh, actually, it's not really clear how we're supposed to be assessing this. So we use the CBAS framework to flip traditional curriculum design so that assessment and the needs of students are at the heart of the system. So you think very carefully about, what your starting question is, what do we want students to know, to be able to do, and to be able to achieve at the end of a program? And from that, you think, right, how are we going to assess that? And we developed the CBAS framework over time. which has there's lots of information about this on the web, by the way, as well. We can talk you through, where we split it into different sections. So your first real goal is identifying what is the purpose of the program. And even this as a discussion point for people can be really interesting sometimes, because different people within teachers within a program can have very different ideas about what the purpose of their program is. And we've identified that the program outcomes need to be meaningful to the students. They need to be accessible. They need to be relevant to the students, and they need to have personal value to the students. The accessible one is really important, because if your program outcomes aren't actually accessible, then your program isn't going to be very good. And I think many of us will have seen some program outcomes that look very grandiose on paper, that have been written for approval purposes. But when you actually look at them, you think, well, how do you actually assess that? How can it be assessed? Second stage of the CBAS is about developing an assessment strategy. And within that, we want something to be, we have the MISCHIEF framework. Assessment strategy needs to be meaningful. It needs to be integrated from different module to module levels. It needs to be scaffolded so that students are introduced to different forms of assessment at different years within the program, and then you don't suddenly introduce a new form of assessment that they've never done in the final year. It needs to be sufficiently challenging. Not to over-challenge the student to cause anxiety or to put them off, but needs to be sufficiently challenging to stretch them. Has to be inclusive, and it has to be engaging or interesting. And of course, it necessarily has to be feasible, and it has to be fair. Feasible both for the students to be able to do it, but feasible both for academics to be able to mark it. If we all had an unlimited amount of time and we only had 3 students to teach, we could probably design the best assessment process in the world. But the reality is we all have more than 2 students, and we don't have an unlimited amount of time. So it has to be fair and feasible both for students to achieve and for academics to have the time to actually mark that work. Next stage we look on is actually assessing competence, encouraging student autonomy where we can, marking criteria that actually attempt to quantify competence, and a reliable and efficient explicit set of marking criteria, and then feedback guides. And then within that, embedding these university literacies is where different parts of the university are involved. For example, you may have a skills team, you may have academic developers, and it's looking at the students, the institutional requirements, developing students' attitudes and capacities, and the education, and of course the academic. And the final stage, which we're still in a process of writing, is that iterative and scholarly reflection on the whole process. Is it working? Can we change it? What do we need to do? What can we do to make it even better?
And I think as well that last one is not just about the curriculum design, but also about the students. So we know that students maximize learning when they have the time to reflect on what it is that they have learned. Yes. And a really big part of developing students' confidence and their future preparedness is giving them the time, the space, but also the help to reflect and to recognise that development. So,
okay, time-wise, we're on 10:04 now.
Yeah, you've got 5 minutes left, guys, before questions.
Right. Do you want to talk through this part, Dom?
Yeah. So I think we'll come to a close, and we'll provide the opportunity for asking questions. But I think the CBAS framework fundamentally is based on 2 key principles. The first one is we need to engage with our stakeholders. We need to engage with students. We need to engage with industry, society, and decide as a group what it is that we're trying to achieve. What is the way that we as a team are going to prepare students for or to raise, enhance and achieve those aspirational futures. And that is going to be completely different depending upon your students, the expertise mix of your staff, what institution you are, all of those sorts of things. So it's not about this one size fits all, but it's about having that really clear purpose, and that purpose that that sings for you as, as a teaching team, and the student body that you have, and having that really clear goal in mind. And then the second part of the CBAS framework is about recognizing assessment as a central part of the curriculum process. It's not an afterthought. It is the most powerful lever that we have for learning. And we always say during these talks, a student can attend none of your course. They can attend none of the lectures, or in many courses, that students can attend nothing and still pass with a first. Or they can attend everything, but they don't pass. They don't get, they don't pass the course unless they pass the assessment. So, the assessment is the driver. And I also, when we talk about this, some people say, well, are you worried about teaching to the test? And for me, well, if the concerns of teaching for the test, that's only a bad thing if the test isn't meaningful.
Yes.
If the test is meaningful, if we're training students or teaching students so that they'll be able to pass this thing, and the thing has meaning, then that's not a problem. That sounds like good pedagogy to me. So I think bringing those two ideas together is sort of the core purpose. So the rest of the symposium, the different project partners are going to talk about the work that they've been doing within the project over the last couple of years, the work that they've been doing within the institutions, and pulling through all the work that they've been doing beforehand, and to talk on some of the specific topics roughly aligned to the stages of the CBAS symposium. So about how we decide the purpose of a program, how we develop an effective assessment strategy, how we implement those assessments on, those individual assessments on the ground, make sure students feel confident in their ability to do it and maximize the learning value of each assessment. And then how do we create a curriculum that builds the student holistically towards the endpoint? And then finally, how we help students reflect and recognize their learning. So obviously, thank you very much for attending today. I genuinely hope it's a sort of a useful and interesting day for you guys. And thank you very much to Kate, who's the sort of the third person in the CBAS leadership team. To our T collaborators, Tom, Dominique, and Mike, much appreciated, and all of our project partners who you're going to hear from today. About their work, and also the QAA for funding the project, and Matt Denton, our key liaison. And there's a contact there.
Thank you, Matt.
If you want to talk to us about it.
Yes. So we've got a few minutes for questions now before we're going to take the first break. So if anybody wants to raise their hand up so we've got a few questions already in the chat box. I think they're related to very specific parts of the speech as we're going along. Caroline asked them, was there a difference between different types of discipline? I think there was around in the area of the question of what's the difference between a degree and a training course. So we talked to, particularly in sort of some of the areas, I remember talking to a colleague who works where they're developing police officers, and he said, well, to be a good police officer, you need to be spending time on the ground. And I'm teaching people to do graduate police work. And I know that they may not be as good as, I think apparently he said that they're not as good at coppers as the ones who are coming in off the streets, which was quite interesting, I think.
Okay, we've got a question from Anna, who's got her hand up.
Anna, right.
Anna, are you able to mute yourself, or do we need to do that on your behalf?
I think I was able to unmic myself, but my camera for some reason is not working. So
apologies. No worries.
I am here. I tried to turn it on, but it's not been found. Anyway, my question is a little bit about, does this all have to be taught in the university curriculum? And it just some of the stuff you brought up that I was thinking a lot of our students acquire by extracurricular, be it volunteer, be it hobbies or employment, and I think now we're sort of shifting. It all has to be done, So where do you see that fit into something like CBAS? And we certainly have an approach we're kind of working through here at Glasgow. But yeah, just curious about that.
I think that's a really interesting question, Anna, because we could say that many students are developing skills through, because we recognise that most students have part-time jobs, some have multiple jobs, they're developing skills in communication, in timekeeping, things there. But unless we know that we're actually assessing something, can we demonstrate or prove to a future stakeholder or employee that they have got those skills? One of the things I've increasingly noticed is that students who are very well regularly turn up very late to lecture sessions. I ask them about the part-time job and they say, no, I have to get there on time for that. So that's maybe about prioritisation. They've got the time development, time skills, but they don't necessarily always use them at university. But I think we have unless students are developing those skills in a way that we can accredit or assess in some way, we can't necessarily prove to external people that they have got those skills. So there is possibly an argument that for some students, we are maybe replicating the development of skills, particularly for mature students who've already often got some of these people skills. But if we don't deliver them and assess them, or don't assess them, we may not have to necessarily deliver them. How can we prove to external partners that students have met those requirements and are what we deem to be a graduate? Has that sort of answered your question, Anna?
I've got something to add, if that's okay. So I think particularly students, and increasingly so, being a student is only part of the student's identity. Whilst they are at university, they often have a lot of other sort of complex facets to their personality. But we often, so particularly in my field in conservation, experience defines the CV. So, students will not get to an interview stage unless they've got some volunteering experience. But that in and of itself creates a massive inequality between the students that have the social capital and the financial capital and the time to dedicate to volunteering, compared to students that there are students that fundamentally do and don't have access to that. So the question from me would be, well, actually, is it more valuable for the university course to develop the academic side of things, or the competency-based side, or would it be more valuable for the students within that university course to have the experience to use the time that they've got on their course towards building the most important part of the CV, which is the volunteering and not the stuff that they learn in lectures? And I think part of the CBUS framework is about reorientating the curriculum towards the most valuable experiences that will give the students a broader idea of what the futures available are, and really help them get there. And thinking about, well, what actually is it that needs to go in the curriculum to do that to its best ability? Yeah.
And also that's what has to be taken out of the curriculum.
Yeah, no, and I agree completely, actually, Dom, in particular, because I work in conservation as well.
Yeah.
And the financial barriers are really a big thing to getting that experience. So just to flip that, could you essentially, and I think competency-based assessment might allow this, I mean, could you have a student that has those skills and experience basically come in, complete competencies, and get their degree? Now that might be controversial. I'm certainly not advocating like 1 year university degrees, but could we do that to facilitate? I don't know. And I'll let other people ask questions. Sorry.
I think my answer to that would be, if the student had the same skills, qualities, experience and knowledge, that should be doable. Whether the current system is able to accommodate such flexibility, I suspect not.
Yeah.
Okay, we've probably got time for one more quick question before we reach the break. If anybody else wants to ask anything. I know Matthew Hillier has made a couple of comments in the chat that it might be useful to circle back to.
Yeah, welcome, Matthew. Programmatic assessment, I think there are definitely some similarities there. And it's certainly something that could be used as part of the CBUS programme. We haven't specifically stipulated how assessment should take place in the programme. What we want people using the CBUS framework to do is to think about what's the most appropriate assessment for their programme, for their discipline, for their students. But I certainly think programmatic assessment is valuable. And from my own point of view, I think some kind of ungrading in the first year is also very valuable as well.
I think that one of the key things with that program competencies, or that competency-based approach, is that they are program level competencies as opposed, and that sort of means that modules automatically have to start thinking about, well, where they are in the context of developing the program level competencies. And I think that really sort of starts to lead towards programmatic assessment. But I think there are also some really challenging aspects of delivering a curriculum. So and particularly as we are now, where we're going to have, more and more departments working with each other, and complex degrees where students are taking modules for across time and space, and then so developing that programmatic approach is probably going to become even more difficult as we go forward. But yeah, as Andrew says, it's less about saying, "Oh, this is what this is the way to deliver the curriculum," and more about sparking those conversations that can help us, constructively align something again to that. Yeah, exactly.
The aspirational futures, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay,
Thank
I think
you
so.
for
We'll take.
I think we'll have to draw the questions to a close. It's time to move into break, which is from 10:15 until 10:30. So if people would like to go and have a quick break, have a cup of tea or a coffee or something, whatever floats your boat, and we'll see you back here in 15 minutes.